we're there, we're synced on both sides. So as we're talking about ACEs, Kaiser Permanente did a study in 1995 to 1997. They published their findings in 1998. The study consisted of a survey of 17,000 people in healthcare managed organizations and HMOs. What they ended up finding is they collected the data and then did a combination of interviews with physicians and other people within that provider network. And ended up figuring out that there was a direct correlation between the number of ACEs you have and how it connects to your long-term health, both your well-being as well as your physical health. We know that the more ACEs you have, the higher correlation there is to major categories of disease. So in Minnesota, this is our specific data. Over half of the Minnesota population that has answered survey questions has at least one or more ACEs. If we take a look at those one or more ACEs, you then suddenly see that 60% of that population, it has 2 or greater ACEs. And then looking at folks that have 4 or more ACEs is now at about 24%. Most of those ACEs fall into the categories of emotional abuse as the primary ACE, living with a problem drinker, parental separation or divorce, mental illness, and physical abuse. Those are the top 5 common ACEs in the state of Minnesota. What we do know is there's additional considerations that happen to offset or mitigate what those adverse childhood experiences might be. So just the environment that you're in. If you're in a calm, stable environment, that's going to help offset ACEs that a child experiences. Just the child's DNA, how they're genetically wired and how that impacts them. We know more and more there's epigenetics, so generations before might have influence on that. And then what we call protective factors. And I'll talk a little bit more about protective factors. Wait. Doozy of a presentation. All right, so I'm going to talk about protective factors without slides because I don't know what it's doing right now.
I think you reloaded it.
Yeah, well, something's still loading on my side, so it is what it is. So protective factors, there is a series of things that happen both in terms of what children experience, what happens in a family setting, and then community and environment that really has an impact on a child and can help mitigate any harm that might be caused by adverse childhood experiences. I think we're getting closer. So I'm going to give you some examples of what those things are. So positive friendships and relationships really make a difference. Children who are able to do well in school and are supported to do so. We know that the safe, stable, and nurturing relationships really are the key underlying factors that give. So even if it's not in the household, other people within that child's life can help lay that groundwork for the protective factors that help. Over there, almost. All right. Now we have the next slide. And it's not showing, we're no longer sharing.
Yeah, we're off.
So children, caregivers, families all contribute to that, right? The more encouragement we can give the child, the more we can do to create a positive atmosphere, a fun and neutral environment even. It's the negative impact that a child has in a lot of different ways that whether that negative environment is at home, whether it's with other caregivers, whether it's at school, that continues to erode a child rather than build a child up. All right, So there is this beautiful pyramid. We've talked a little bit about what those components are already. And I'm gonna just apologize. So when you take a look at the top of the pyramid, we're talking about how it impacts a person. So originally, when the ACEs pyramid was designed, it talked about advanced first childhood experiences, how it disrupts neurological development, how it can be impacted by environment. It goes through behaviors, understanding the lifelong impact on health, and then the top box on the pyramid is early death. So in instances where there is 6 or greater ACEs in a child's life prior to the age of 18, we know that the life can be reduced by up to 20 years. 4 or more ACEs, we know that there's significant increased risk for 10 out of 10 leading causes of death. So suicide, depression, substance use, heart disease, stroke, asthma, COPD, cancer. Diabetes, cancer, and Alzheimer's are, so we have 4 or greater ACEs in your background, and those factors have not been mitigated. We know that that can show up in many of those different disease categories. All right, so we're going to back up. We know that ACEs not only have a profound impact on a child's development. We've talked a little bit about how it impacts the body, but we also know that it impacts the child's brain. So not all stress is bad stress, right? For those of you who know my son Miles, I remind him as he goes through finals and midterms, this is positive stress, right? When you're in the process of taking a test, that's not a bad thing. That helps push them, that helps them learn, that helps them develop further along. Sports, events, recitals, right? There's a whole series of things that we do through our lifetime that we would consider to be positive stress, that can be good, that helps a kid grow. It's mild in nature. There might be some elevated heart rate, like now when my technology is working. There is what we call tolerable stress, right? So when you're experiencing stress and you have an adult or child who is able to buffer that, can really help them understand how to get through it, how to manage it, even though they're experiencing things, they're safe, they're okay. Like we learn things out of this. Having stress in your life isn't necessarily bad. We need to have it to develop coping and resilience, right? It's the toxic stress that we worry about, which is, and somehow, okay. The toxic stress, which is extreme, it happens with a great degree of frequency. And 2 things, either it's the caregiver who is creating the stress for a child, or it's a caregiver who is absent, who's not there to buffer it. That then creates what we call toxic stress and has a pretty significant impact on a child. We want kids to have manageable stress, stress that they can learn how to deal with. We want them to grow and develop from it in a reasonable doses so that they can develop the resilience that they need to have later on in life. So we're going to talk a little bit about brain development, just briefly. So we know the brain develops from the bottom up, right? So at the very bottom is the brainstem, heart rate, respiratory, blood pressure, temperature regulation, right? As you're hitting the next levels, it's very somatic still, right? Sleep, appetite, your ability to coordinate your motor and your regulatory functions. The 3rd level is your social emotional, self-regulation, your emotional connections and attachment. And this is where we oftentimes see behavioral problems show up. You need to develop these bottom steps first before you can get to the step of concrete thought, abstract thought, the things that you need for executive function skills, the things that you need for learning, for planning, right? The things that you need later on in adulthood to be able to function, right? To be able to hold a job, to be able to have a relationship with other people, maintain a marriage. What does it take to be able to parent kids? If you don't have those things, it becomes very problematic, and we start to see that over again. So just basic participation even in society. Okay. This chart really quick on the very far side of it is pre-birth. The blue section is 0 to 12 months. This is how much of your brain development around sensory pathways, language, even your initial higher cognitive function that happens in the first 12 months of life. I wish I would have known this before my first kid was born. I think we inherently know some of it, but we don't realize, you know, we now talk about it as the first 1,000 days, right? From conception to the age of 2, about where so much development happens. And if we don't start kids off in the right way, it's not to say it can't be repaired, but we have a different baseline for these kids. So that slide's coming to you out of Harvard as the sources for that. We also know that as our neural connections happen, what it looks like at birth in this first segment, 6 years old, and the level of activity that just jumped off, right? So you can imagine what's happening from 0 to 6 and the amount of activity. But in our adolescent years, we prune those pathways, not because we're getting rid of all of the activity, we're trying to strengthen the core things, right? We know what we do with trees. We don't want all of these branches going. We want really solid, well-developed branches so that the tree is healthy in the long haul. So if you don't use your neural pathways, you're going to lose them. Or if you're using negative neural pathways and neural pathways that aren't really productive to what you need long-term, you're going to reinforce the wrong things. Now, we don't stop growing, but it just takes a lot more work, right, of our neural connections. So again, out of Harvard, we see that the brain still can respond and change. It slows down at some point. I'm not going to mention the average age of this room right now because I'm hitting the back end of this. But it does talk about the amount of change that is then later required to make that change. So we know that if we can get earlier on and impact and make those changes where those baselines have been developing in the wrong way, the more successful we're going to be at it. It's not to say we can't make those changes, but if we do that later on in life, we're going to have to put in far more change. So we're going to shift over to early childhood learning a little bit. Right. So we know that there are building blocks to develop resilience. When we can ensure strong starts, that's absolutely what we want to do. We want to help kids develop their self-awareness, understand their values, their emotions, an understanding of themselves and how they relate and connect in the world. What's their strengths and how do we promote those strengths and see those? And then how do we help redirect and fortify weaknesses that a young person might have? We want to take a look at how do we protect and promote social norms, protect them against violence and adversity. How do we teach the resilient skills and help them understand that they are competent and they are capable and help them get through that. We know that social emotional learning is absolutely critical. Again, if we think back to those tiers that I just showed you of the brain, in order for a child to get to that top level and do their best thinking, we need them to be solid in that layer before in the third level where their social emotional capacity is built at a level that they can do the thinking that we need later on. So the preschool that we happen to run, it's in Frogtown, Dale University area. We serve kids that have pretty tough starts. It comes at the intersection of poverty, instability, trauma, that many of these kids have faced already by the time that they're 3 years old. I'm gonna see if we can run this, and I'm kind of hesitant. I've got a video. They're gonna tell you better than I what this is about. So let's see if we can.
I just want to confirm, you're not hooked up to Zoom anymore, right? Like, I think you got kicked off the Zoom thing, so. If I put the mic back on, then you're not gonna have that feedback. No, you're off, you're off. But I gotta put the mic on with the power. I think you need to play the slide. You've just been in the.
I think I've got a network issue.
Oh,
That's what's.
you're disconnected.
We'll see.
How's your heart rate?
You know,
Is the video posted on your laptop, or is it out in the internet somewhere?
it should have been. Clipped to.
This is kind of just right. Oh, yeah.
One last time. And if not, then I'm not, and I'll just tell you about the program.
Alexis, can I suggest that we go with the slideshow as opposed to this preview, is the editing thing? So yeah, slideshow across the top there. You see slideshow? There it is.
Yeah.
And like launch the slideshow, play the current slide.
Oh, let's watch that one.
That's not why you're not getting the drop down menus.
Great.
That show on the web or about.
This PowerPoint is on your computer, or is it posted out in somewhere else?
It is through our, it's through our internal.
So it's a connected. Doesn't want to.
It doesn't even want to go with sections.
So. Try refreshing that.
Yeah, the problem is I keep trying different things, and we're just losing time as we go. So. The kids that are served here, there's a number of components. So I'm gonna talk a little bit about the trauma-informed classroom first, and I'll tell you why we do that. So we operate at a ratio of 4:1. So 4 students for every 1 teacher. The reason we do this, what the typical licensing standard is in this area is 10:1, right? So we operate at less than half, because these kids need a high level of really positive relationships. And they can't get that to do the developmental repair work that they need to have without making sure that they're touching a lot more adults, having that guidance and that reinforcement in the classroom on the spot all of the time. We actually start our classroom, I would suggest, at when we pick the kids up at the door. So we provide our own transportation. One, We know that these kids are in environments that they may not make it into the preschool if we require families to bring them on their own. Right, so if we go and pick the kids up, it's an added layer that we provide. But the teachers are also on the bus with the kids. So as they're getting on and getting them and meeting them at the door, it's a connected relationship, it's a familiar adult. And we immediately start finding out information about what happened the night before, what happened that morning. Are there things that we can anticipate might start to show up in the classroom based off of what that child's experience was in the last 12 hours, right? So that makes a difference. We can also be very flexible in our response. So if we go to a door and a kid's not quite ready and there's a stop a couple blocks away, we can go get the next kid and come back and get that first kid because they're much more likely to be in the classroom that day. And if they miss that day, they've missed some really critical component in time that where they could have learned, where they could have had positive connections versus having additional disappointments. So in that classroom, we make sure that our staff are trauma informed, understand that these are behaviors often that are showing up from a trauma history, rather than the child being a bad kid. They're not bad kids. They are showing up, their behavior is showing up as a result of what they've experienced. So being able
Are
to.
there any homeless kids?
Our kids, many of them come to us and are referred through child protection. They might be referred through the school system, other daycares, childcares in the area that the kid's not able to be successful in those environments. Again, kids may not be living with biological parents. That might be a foster home, it might be a kinship relative caregiver. In the instance, if I could play the video, or there is a video out on the St. Paul Synod's website, that if one of the kids is adopted and she had a very significant trauma history before she was able to come. We integrate therapy into our preschool. So externally, we bring in speech therapy, we bring in occupational therapy for those kids that qualify. If they need to get that off-site in a different place, we know that some of those kids, again, may not get those services. It's just one extra step that a family has to take, and if the caregiver is struggling, they may not get those services. We have embedded a mental health therapist into the classroom, right? So as things are showing up, you get immediate feedback and response. They sit down and make plans and work with the teachers on a weekly basis about what needs to happen in that setting. Finally, we do targeted home visiting.
How many kids do you have in your school?
Right now, we're operating up to 24 kids, so 2 classrooms. With 3 teachers per classroom. We are looking to open a 3rd classroom in our current site. But then this project is actually about replicating the entire program to another location. So we would go from being able to serve 24 kids up to 36. And taking a look at the new location, we'll be able to serve another 36 kids.
Ooh, yay.
So targeted home visiting, we want, it's a 2-generational model, right? This doesn't happen with working with kids alone. We've got to make sure that the teachers, that the staff, that the social workers are connecting with the families in their homes, seeing what's happening in that setting, and being able to support them, helping them develop and set goals. How do we help them find resources to reduce their stress? How do we talk to them about parenting and what we're seeing in the classroom and how to replicate that in the home setting? So there's consistency between what the interventions are that are working with the child. So typically, when we think about kindergarten readiness, we're thinking about the 3 R's, right? Reading, writing, and arithmetic. In this case, we know that we have to go back and reset the social emotional learning first, and making sure that there's much more relational components that happen that is absolutely critical for what we need later on for the executive functioning, the emotional processing skills that they will need to be able to do that other work on. I'm going to spend a little bit more time on this next slide. So on your right-hand side is 16 kids The purple is where those kids were when they came to us in the fall, in the beginning of a year, and what that baseline looked like. The blue shows the growth at the end of one academic calendar, right? So across 7 different assessment areas of where a child is at, we can see on the left-hand side what collectively that looks like for a child's growth. From where they come in at baseline to where they should be developmentally, we close that gap by 50% in 1 year.
Whoa.
So we know that we touch all of the domains, all 7 areas that we need to see growth in. We also know that growth is not consistent. We see far more growth. We have consistent growth across all areas in the first semester. In the second semester, we see a dramatic uptick in growth in math, science, and social studies in semester 2, once that baseline of social emotional learning is established. So I'm going to talk really quickly about future implications. So one of the things that I have learned along the way is early childhood learning is one of the areas that should also be talked about, and not just from a brain sciences staff, but from economic development. If we want our economics to develop, we need to grow in that area. So you'll see this material showing up in a number of other places. We have a Nobel Prize winning economist, James Heckman, that talks about this and talks about why we need to be investing in early childhood now. We have the Minneapolis Federal Reserve talking about the same things, about if we don't get these kids on the right trajectory, one, our kids being in settings where they're able to be appropriately supported, being able to be supported at all is important for parents to be able to go to work, right? So it's the workforce behind the workforce. 2, if we get their brains on track the right way, we can get that executive functioning on track, we can get the social emotional learning. We're developing our future workforce, and we're mitigating a number of other systems that need to kick in if we don't do it. So what we know is 88% of kids that do not graduate from high school were not able to be reading proficiently by 4th grade. 82% of that population that does not graduate is incarcerated at some point in their lifetime. So that's a major system that we start to pay for. We're paying for remedial educational services. We pay for other financial services. We pay for the child welfare system. So we can have kids that can contribute to society long-term, or we can pay for it in other ways. So what we know is by investing in these populations, right, we have a $16 return for every $1 public dollar invested in this area. Right, so we need to continue to think about what are the crime-related costs. Last year at the legislature, I got to sit and listen to public safety testify. I got to listen to the Department of Economics and Employment Services, DEED, testify. I got to listen to homeless services and housing services testify about why early childhood services is so important. I don't think I've ever seen some of those intersections come together in quite that way before. So why the East Side? We know there's so many pieces. Economic disparities that were happening on the East Side is about 30% lower than Greater St. Paul. And what we're seeing, we know that the overall population has additional educational attainment opportunities. We know that there's the highest concentration of kids 0 to 5 that are BIPOC. Right, so we're looking at 92% of the East Side 0 to 5 population are Black, Indigenous, Southeast Asian, Native American. And there is a child care shortage right now. So any additional child care slots that can be provided is fantastic, but we also don't want any child care slots. We know that while family providers are fantastic, that it's really center-based providers that do a much more grounding in some of the early learning. But when we're looking at a trauma supported program, if we can get that social emotional early learning on track first, that's what we should be doing for this population to make sure that they're tracking to where they need to be for kindergarten readiness. Here's just a little bit of the breakdown on what we see. So this is Ward 6, which really takes a look at oh goodness, from about 36, Highway 36 on the north side, 94 on the south side. White Bear Avenue would be the far east boundary, backing up to about 35 is a large portion of Ward 6. And this is what the kids 0 to 5 will look like right now from zero for those populations and how that breaks down racially. So families together east side. I think Peter led off beautifully with this is a partnership with the St. Paul Area Synod between Lutheran Social Service and Bishop Lull and all of the congregations here. So you are one of them. We kicked this off was the money for this is raised that we could begin to build. And that's the timeline that we need to be able to make it successful for a September 2024 launch. So what we know is after the funds are raised and we can actually do the construction is not the piece that takes the longest. The piece that takes the longest is you have to get licensed by the state of Minnesota, one, and then we are also NACE accredited. So under early childhood standards, we would partner with the Minnesota Department of Education to take a look at the scholarship funding that we need for the kids that participate there. And we would need to do all of that build out and get those pieces in place before we start hosting kids and hiring staff. So that is what we are hoping to do. I think I'm probably running up against time frames right about now. Are there questions about what this project are? Please.
I would like to know, the statistics were 0 to 5 for the east side, but at what age do you actually welcome children into the program? Is it 2? Is it 3?
So yeah, the current therapeutic preschool operates for 3 to 5 year olds. That third classroom would be a younger classroom that we're hoping to add on, which would start as soon as 16 months. The sooner we can get kids into place, the better we are to mitigate what would come, right? Just looking at those developmental things. If we can, the earlier we can do it, that prevention and early intervention, we would love to intervene earlier. And that is the hopes for the replication site as well, is we would love to do a younger classroom to start as soon as 16 months.
Anticipate having any dedicated funding through mental health resources?
We have had some conversations about it. Right now, it is not. It is all there's 2 primary, I should say that there's 3 primary funding sources. The Department of Education, CCAP, so child care assistance, is the second piece of it, and then philanthropic helps.
In the for example, in the Ward 6, the
Yes.
area that you talked about, we can kind of get our heads around it. I'm not a native St. Paulite, but I think I got a feel for it. What do you have an idea or an estimate of what the total population is that you're addressing in those age groups, and like the 3 to 5 group? How many kids are in Ward 6 that are you addressing?
It is
1% of the population or 10% of the population?
no, it is a really large age population. It's actually their 0 to 5 is probably one of the fastest growing areas in the city of St. Paul right now. I can't tell you the exact percentage. I have it on a different slide on a different deck. The therapeutic preschool is meant to serve a very select group of kids. There are a lot of other general childcare programs. I've got a friend down the street who runs charter Spanish immersion program that has a preschool component. Kids that are able to be successful in those settings or successful in early childhood programs through St. Paul Public Schools, through Head Start, through those things. That is absolutely where these kids should be. But when we're talking about kids with this trauma background that need that extra level of support, it is a really unique setting. There are very few therapeutic preschools. There are some day schools. Day school programs that happen through educational settings when a kid needs even more intensive services. We kind of hit a sweet spot that's not well represented right now. So there's a couple preschools in Minneapolis that do it. We are one of the few in St. Paul, and this is a replication of that same group. So there's far more kids right now with childcare vacancies. There's 2 openings for every 1 slot that occurs. So it's not the lack of demand. There's plenty of childcare that's needed, but we want to target the absolute right kids that can benefit most from this program that can't be successful elsewhere.
Where are you planning to build the second?
Yeah, so the site has now been announced not that long ago with the bishop. So Grace Lutheran Church, so we're not doing a complete build from scratch. Their lower level of their church. We vetted multiple locations, and why we chose Grace Lutheran Church is we can use the entire basement, lower level of the church. It has a dedicated entrance. It has optimal ability to access the grounds for the required playground space. You need bathrooms for preschools. It's one of the few buildings where we don't have to do tons of infrastructure changes. So for the plumbing changes that need to happen, we don't have to do too much to Grace to bring that building up.
Where is Grace?
So Grace is at the intersection of White Bear Lake and 94. So if you know, like Sunray Mall and Target and that stuff, it is in the northwest corner of that intersection. And they kind of tossed their hat in the ring, and so did a couple other congregations, and we realized that was absolutely a great spot. The therapeutic preschool that we looked at and toured in South Minneapolis, boy, about a year ago, they built a building from scratch that's 2 stories, and it was a $21 million build many years ago. So the fact that we're able to come and do this project for 1 million rather than 21 million, we wanted to find an existing space that we could revitalize and be very well connected to communities.
So we've been asked the congregation to consider contributions to the capital campaign. This is a piece of it.
This is one.
How does that break out? Can we target a contribution to a specific program within that initiative?
And some congregations, I believe, have already done that. So there are 4 pillars to the campaign. This is one of 4. It is the largest chunk of the funds that the bishop is raising. And I do believe that those funds can be specifically put towards the therapeutic preschool. And it's, I think we call it Families Together East Side is what it's being titled for the campaign.
I noticed that you addressed different needs, and one was, or interventions, and one was to the home.
Yeah.
How much of a parent education component is part of the program? So
we are at least in a home 1 to 2 times a month. We also do group work at our Frogtown facility, and I'm sure we would do something comparable on the east side, where parents come into group and are able to connect with each other as peers and understand what's working, what's not working. We provide education in that setting and supports, and then talk about other resources. So I would say anywhere from, if the family's engaged in it deeply, probably 3 touch points a month. Other questions in the back?
I keep thinking about your comment about the development that takes place between birth and 1 year.
Yes.
And I know you can't address everything, and I commend you for what you're doing, but I just wondered, you know, what kind of education might there be, or what other interventions for parents who are expecting?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. And I'd say there's a whole range of things that are out there. I would love to see more. I think we need to sharpen that point a little bit more. For Lutheran Social Service, we operate about 30 different lines of service. The therapeutic preschool is one small component under our youth services. And so we do have other programs. We operate beds for young women who are pregnant and parenting that otherwise might be home. So getting them a strong start. We will be doing some work in the next several years to take a look at how do we create that next level for those young ladies so that they have an in-between site, not completely independent, but where they have stable housing, that they've got the resources, they can go out and seek employment or further their education. And so doing that along the way. I think throughout a number of our services are able to provide those touch points, but they're typically in connection with other programs that we're operating. I think there is so much information that we have learned, and honestly, ACEs was not in the mainstream, I don't believe, until the last 5 years or so. We're hearing a lot about it, and people are really beginning to understand what those connections are. The education that is coming out of not just Harvard, they're a place that I track their information pretty diligently. But we're seeing more and more information come out of some of those institutions about how absolutely important it is that we get in front of these kids and get this information in early. And yeah, parents, if we can get them, I hosted my niece's baby shower yesterday. So just even taking a look at her and having those conversations of you're reading to your child before birth and after birth and in this first year, and why we now, like every child that enters the family, we inundate them with books. Because that language is off the chart. So, right, it's understanding it's not just mom, it's also that village around that woman and that young family to make sure that they're getting off to the right start. So I think there's more programming that can still come. And I think you're getting called in a different direction. I'm going to take the last question. Yes, please.
Do you run into parents who are unwilling to, or just unable to care about what you're doing?
You know, the families that we're dealing with, it depends on the family structure. Again, we're dealing with some biological parents. We're not dealing with all of the biological parents, right? It might be a relative, it might be a foster and adoptive home. So I think that's why we try to do multiple components. We do as much relational development that we can in the classroom and make sure that we're doing that transportation. But not all families have the same level of stability and have the same struggles. And so that's really going to have a different impact. Thank you. I think